Welcome to this webcast. We're glad you're joining us for Assessing Student Learning Outcomes in Undergraduate STEM Courses. Good morning. I'm your host, Jennifer Wicks, behind the scenes from Learning and Development. Happy to work with Frank A. Gomez and Monica Alarcon on today's webcast. Thank you for letting us know which campus you're joining from in the poll beneath my webcam. And as you can see, we have people across the system joining. Please do feel free to share that link. I did post it over in the open chat. Feel free to share that with your colleagues and invite them to also join today's session. As you can see, we will have live captions throughout the webcast, and we look forward to your engagement through that chat pod, asking for your comments and questions. We will have more of the Q&A open discussion at the very end of the session today, so please stay tuned for that as you do continue to enter all of your comments and questions. We have quite a lineup for you of excellent presentations, and with that, I'd like to introduce your host, or our host for this session, moderated by Dr. Frank A. Gomez, Executive Director, STEMnet at the Office of the Chancellor. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Gomez to begin.
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to another webcast from STEMnet. It's a pleasure to see all of you today. Assessment can be a highly charged word in educational circles. It's complex and constantly changing, overlapping with major societal issues regarding quality of education, diversity, and equality of access, the implementation of district and state guidelines, the efforts to evolve national standards, and many other aspects of our current educational state. At its heart and at its best, assessment speaks to the continuing dedicated struggles of teachers and educators nationwide to improve instruction, to reach out to all students in effective and stimulating ways. Today, it gives me great pleasure to bring together exemplars reflecting some of the very best in assessment from across the CSU. Before we begin, I want to remind the audience to use the open chat box on their screens to type in their questions. Our speakers, when not presenting, will do their very best to respond in real time. So let's begin the presentations with Regis Komperda from San Diego State University. Regis, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'm really excited to be here today to tell you about a recently funded project I've been working on with my collaborators, Jack Barbera and Jordan Harshman. We all work in the field of chemistry education research, and this project is a way for us to support assessment practices in this community. So I want to start by giving a little bit of background as to kind of what inspired us for this project. So we were thinking about the needs of our community related to assessment. A lot of times in the context as researchers or as teachers, we're asked to draw conclusions about student outcomes. That might be as a result of students in different courses or some sort of teaching intervention. But to draw these conclusions, we need high quality data. And where do these data come from? So we typically collect these data using what I refer to as measurement instruments. And this is kind of a broad term that helps me encompass things like tests, concept inventories, surveys, basically anything that allows us to take some student information and turn that into a number. Now, there are many other ways to assess that aren't quantitative. That's just what I'm going to focus on today. So let's say you're asked to draw some conclusions about student outcomes. For example, maybe you want to know their understanding of acid-base chemistry or look at something about their lab skills. How do you know if this instrument already exists or if this is something that you need to create from scratch? This is a particular issue if you're not familiar with the literature, you don't know where to look, or you just don't have the time to read through a bunch of primary documents. So that's one piece of what we're trying to address with this project. The second piece is, how do we know if the instrument is going to provide high quality data, right? So just because the instrument exists doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the right one for your context. So that's the other piece of this, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I mean by high quality data. So when we talk about data quality evidence, particularly with measuring people, as we think about when we're measuring students, we generally think about the guidelines established in the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, which is a joint publication from the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement and Education. We've also translated some of this particularly for the chemistry education community, and there are quite a few things we think about, but the two main ones I'm going to talk about today. The first is validity, which kind of maps onto this idea of accuracy, which is basically just, is there evidence that the scores you're collecting measure what you intend to collect? So for example, going back to this idea of acid-base understanding. So I might write an instrument or use someone else's instrument and actually find out that the way the questions are written, I'm not really testing acid-base understanding, but maybe I'm testing more reading comprehension or math ability. So that will be a kind of threat to the validity or the accuracy of those scores. The other piece of this is reliability, which maps onto the idea of precision. So in a laboratory setting, this makes sense as scientists, right? We would just do multiple trials. We would see kind of what the spread is. It's a little bit trickier to do this with humans. As you measure humans, they tend to change. So there's not necessarily an expectation that you would get the same measurement if you measured a person, multiple times. But we do have some kind of statistical ways to deal with that. So that is part of what we think about. Would we get consistent measurements if everything was the same between administrations? So the other thing we recognize as scientists is not only do I have to have this information, but I can't just collect it once and be done, right? We don't take an instrument right from the factory and say, great, they calibrated it once, I never have to do anything else. We really should be collecting this validity and reliability information each time an instrument is used. And that can get unwieldy. If we've got a very popular instrument, it's got a lot of use cases in the literature, how are you supposed to keep track of it? Is that your responsibility to read every single paper? What if different papers draw different conclusions about validity and reliability? How do we kind of synthesize that into one cohesive framework? So those are the things that we were thinking about for this project. And this project is called the Chiral Project, which stands for the Chemistry Instrument Review and Assessment Library. What this is going to be is a centralized resource for the chemistry education community to find the sort of instrument information that I've been talking about, not only what's out there, but what sort of data quality evidence exists. We're going to be integrating this into an existing community resource supported by our professional organization, the American Chemical Society, and that resource is the Chemical Education Exchange, or ChemEdX. So if this is something that you're not already familiar with, I highly encourage you to check it out. It's already a very rich resource with lots of things to support teaching and learning in chemistry, and we're just going to add this as an additional piece of what is available to the community. So things that are going to be included in this, like I've been talking about, a searchable catalog of instruments that have been used in chemistry education. What publications are these referenced in? Are there alternative versions? Maybe somebody made it for undergrads, but has modified it to be used with middle school students, and that might be appropriate. Has it been translated into other languages? And then again, when we have the studies, who's provided data quality evidence? And then what we think is really important about this project is synthesizing that evidence in a way that's a little more accessible and understandable and doesn't require you to go into the literature yourself. So we're going to do NSF-style panel reviews where the panels are going to be responsible for reading all of that primary literature and synthesizing it down into a couple paragraph summary of this is what the bulk of evidence in the literature says about this instrument. In addition, we're going to have a glossary of assessment terms because I know that some of the things that we think about, validity, reliability, if you've been in the literature, you may have seen things like Cronbach's alpha or factor analysis. These might not be part of your typical daily vocabulary, so we want to make sure that people going to this website can get some in-depth information on that sort of information, what to do with it, why it matters. So here's a mock-up of what the website is going to be looking like. So you notice that this is all kind of in future tense, and I'll kind of explain our timeline later. But on the left-hand side, this idea that you can search by the type of thing you're looking for. So cognitive would be like content knowledge, like acid-base. Affective would be things like, oh, I want to look at student self-efficacy or belonging, things like that. Or specific topics, acid-base, attitudes, and so on. We intend to list, the title of the instrument, the acronym, telling you a little bit about the description, when was it published, what format is it in, who is it intended to be used with, how long is this public kind of peer review available, are there multiple versions, all of that sort of information. So where are we at with this project? Currently, we are in the first year of this project. My research group has been responsible for combing through the literature, identifying these instruments, building the database, and doing the primary cataloging. We've also got other research groups creating the glossary, doing interviews with our target user population to refine that website design so that it looks a lot fancier than that mock-up I just showed you there. We're going to plan for the peer review panels to occur in our second year of the project. And when we're ready to launch this to the general public, we're going to do that through ChemEdX as well as the Chemistry Education Listserv. So again, those are two great resources. If you're not already familiar with them, that will be part of this. And again, announcements will go there. So I recognize that what I've just been giving you is a lot of to be determined, right? Things that are coming forward. And I didn't want to leave people here with that hanging like, oh, I hope it's coming soon. So what I want to spend the last little part of this talking about is the resources that we are building upon. We are certainly not the first people to want to have this information in a centralized place. So I want to start by talking about the resources that are available in the chemistry community specifically. So the American Chemical Society has an exams institute where they develop and release standardized assessments that are nationally normed for different content areas, from general chemistry through physical chemistry and everything in between. There's also a list of assessment resources that have been compiled by the Brett's research group, and so that includes a lot of the concept inventories that they've developed as well. So those might be very specific things like, again, this acid-base idea, redox chemistry, things like that. So they're a little bit more targeted than these big American Chemical Society exams. Something else I want to make sure that I'm highlighting is in physics, which is Physport. If you are in physics and you are not familiar with Physport, and I highly encourage you to take a look at that. We are modeling a lot of our website off of Physport, and this is actually something that we've put someone on our advisory board to help us. So Physport works in a very similar way where you can search and you can say, oh, I want to look for something that helps me with like forces, right? So the force concept inventory. And they do the same idea where they tell you about what sort of literature evidence they have for the quality of these assessment instruments and things like that. Geology also maintains a list. Engineering is not currently available online, but they have also developed this. If you want to go broader, there's the Stellar database for the STEM Learning and Research Center. Very new is the edinstruments.com website. This might not be ideal for more college level. It's a little bit geared more towards K-12, but there's some nice affective instruments in there if you're looking for measuring things other than content knowledge. And then the other thing to talk about is in psychology. So psychology has been thinking about a lot of these things for a very long time, and they've got some great resources, again, to look at things that are not specifically STEM content, but other things you might be interested in for your students. What is their motivation? What is their sense of belonging? And things like that. So this is the list of resources that I encourage you to use sort of as a stopgap until Chiral is up and running. But I also do want to say that in the meantime, I am happy to answer any kind of assessment-related questions or help anybody start their journey toward thinking about research in STEM and doing assessments. And my contact information is at the bottom of these slides. And so with that, I'm going to switch us over to our next presenter. And I am very happy to introduce Rachel Teasdale, professor in the Department of Geological and Environmental Sciences at Chico State.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'd like to talk to you today about a project that my colleague Hannah Aird and I have been working on to assess our course assessments. We teach a large lecture geoscience course at CSU Chico. In 2016, we revised the course. We wanted to make it more engaging for students. We thought, based on loads of research, that by making the course more engaging, students would have better motivation for learning. So we wanted to use more relevant course topics and integrate small group work and in-class activities. Let's see. So the big changes, or the overall change, was guided by the backwards design process, where we started by looking at the student learning outcomes and skills that we wanted our students to have by the end of the course. So that included a review of content learning, as well as skills like gleaning data, gleaning information from maps and graphs. We also wanted our students to have practice communicating science together and working in teams. So after identifying those student learning outcomes, we developed our assessments, and that includes formative and summative assessments. This is a bit of a flipped course, so they do work outside of class before each class session. And so there's assessment involved with that, as well as in-class formative assessments. But what I'm going to talk to you today is about our summative assessments. And we decided to start there because these are big point earning factors in our course, at least in the in-person version. So we have 3 exams, and they're 2-stage exams with individual and group components. And I can talk to you about how that works another time. Most of the points are earned on these exams through multiple choice questions, but we also have short answer questions. So following backwards design, after we figured out what we needed to know from the students to know if they had accomplished the learning outcomes, was to then develop activities that would guide them towards that learning. And then we also had some logistics with, what kind of room could accommodate a large number of students. And we also have student assistants, which is another fun thing to share another time. So what are our results? Well, we were absolutely crushed to find that we had no significant change in our DFW rate, our students who earned grades of D, F, or withdrew from the course. So once we picked ourselves up off the floor and decided to figure out what didn't happen, we went through a painstaking process of evaluating the course design, the student learning outcomes, the activities, were the practices that we used, the pedagogical practices that we used. And we felt pretty confident that those components of the redesign had a lot of strength. They were research-based, and also we saw students actively engaged in class, so it made sense that that our DFW rate should have gone down. Then we started looking at our assessments, and we realized, oh, we really just did what we've always done with our assessments, and maybe a course design should involve more careful, detailed evaluation. So we started looking at blocks of questions. I mentioned that the multiple choice questions are the largest point earners on these summative assessments, the exams, and so we started there. So we looked at questions in topical blocks. So the graph that I'm showing you here shows student success on different questions associated with landslides. So this was from our landslide module. And we had students looking at landslide susceptibility maps, and they were predicting where landslides would or would not occur, and those were the types of activities that we did. And the bars in green show the student results, or the student success, the percentage of students who got questions correct on questions that had related to the active learning component of the course activities. The one orange bar represents a question that we included from the reading. So the students clearly did much better on questions that were associated with the activity than associated with the reading. And so we thought, okay, maybe this is something that we need to look at. So we went ahead and categorized all of our questions and our instructional styles. So you can see on the left, the list of items is the style of instruction, the categories of instruction. The purple ones, you'll notice, are fairly passive. Students are watching or reading, but not interacting. The in-class activities, that item is shown in green because it's more of an active learning process. Then we also looked at our assessment styles and categorized those, and we found that there is a category of more passive assessment, the recall or regurgitation, and then several categories for more active assessment, where students are actually applying their knowledge or proving their procedural knowledge, identifying a method or a best process, or making interpretations. So when we look at student success on questions that are aligned, so the instructional style is aligned with the assessment style. So a purple instructional style and a purple assessment style would be aligned, or a green instruction, green assessment would be aligned. When they're aligned, students do better. When they're not aligned, when the questions are not aligned with the instructional style, you can see that the student performance is lower. I mentioned the passive-active category, and we also looked at question or student success in passive questions versus active questions, and we were thrilled to find that students have higher performance on active questions than on passive questions. So now we see where students are performing better, and we can look at how that helps overall. So We also broke down each question type. So we looked at not aligned questions that are active versus those that are passive. Those are the red bars. And we looked at aligned questions that are passive or active, and those are the green bars. And we're happy to see that the best performance comes from questions that are aligned and active. And that's great, because that's exactly what we want our students, the way we want our students to learn. We want them to be able to do something with the information rather than just regurgitate it. All right, so are these results equitable? We have a large proportion of students who fit in traditionally underrepresented groups. And by that, we include traditionally underrepresented minority students, first-generation students, and Pell eligible students. And you can see the percentage, the proportions of each of those in our course. And so now what we're looking at is the solid colored bars are student performance for students who do not belong to any of the underrepresented groups. And the stippled bars represent performance by students who are included in the underrepresented groups. And the gap, the number above the bars, represents the difference between the two groups of students on each question type. And you'll see that for the aligned questions, we have about a 5% gap. And that's not good enough. We need to eliminate this gap if at all possible. So that's one of the things that we're continuing to work on. We see the smallest gap in the not aligned passive questions, but we don't really care because those are not good questions. All students do badly on those. So that we've eliminated the gap where students are not succeeding is not good enough. We're a little encouraged that our 5% gap for aligned questions is lower than our overall DFW gap. But like I said, we have more work to do to improve. If we had only used aligned active questions, if only we had, well, 87% of our students' grades would have increased by 6%. Our students who who belong in any of the underrepresented groups would have increased slightly more. That's not a statistically significant difference. So again, we have more work to do, but I'll take 6%, and I bet most of my students would take a 6% improvement. So we're encouraged. So moving forward, we're continuing to use aligned active questions. We have to use fewer of them because they take longer. They're harder, they're more intensive for students to answer. And then we're continuing with this analysis, and in the final throes of preparing a manuscript. Our course is cost-free, we're committed to that, and we continue to modify our activities and even our student learning outcomes as we learn more from our students and with our students. So the graphics there show an example of one of our activities where students make a brochure about the hazards of one of the counties in California. So in summary, I hope I have shown you that the use of active learning strategies engages students and also helps them learn, and we can assess that if we craft careful questions. That definitely requires some time. But I think the effort is worth it. And frankly, once you develop these types of aligned active questions, it gets easier to add more to sort of the pool of questions that are available. All our students are benefiting, and we're working to make sure that all of our students have equitable access to learning in our courses. So I'd be happy to answer questions later, but that's what I have to share for you today. So I want to introduce Gina Passante from Cal State Fullerton, who will talk to us about assessments for just-in-time instruction.
Thank you very much. Before I get started, I just wanted to say that while I'm honoring my commitment to speak today, I will be supporting the Shutdown STEM and Particles for Justice, calling for everyone to take some time out of their daily schedule to think about how they can participate in the Black Lives Matter movement and what we can do to help eliminate anti-Black racism in STEM and in academia. And I'm going to be taking time to do that later today and later this week. And I would encourage all of you to do the same. But now I'm here to talk to you about assessments. I am a physics education researcher. Most of my research involves studying how students think about physics concepts. And in order to gather data for my research, I need to assess them, right? I need to create assessments that probe student thinking. And the assessments that I'm going to talk to you about today started because of my research, but they've really impacted the way that I teach. And so I'm going to share with you how they've impacted my teaching practice in the hopes that you might find something that'll work for your classes as well. So we all know about different types of graded assessments. We all use them in our courses, things like quizzes and exams, homework assignments and projects, and these are all wonderful. We also have ungraded assessments or formative assessments. Today it's already been mentioned that there are conceptual inventories. I've listed a couple. If you're a physicist, you might be familiar with these. And these are assessments that you often give at the beginning and end of a semester to judge the learning gain by your students throughout the course. There are also more less formal ways to get this information from your students, and I'm calling this roughly student surveys. We can do these before lecture, we can do them in lecture or after lecture, and these are all ungraded ways to get information about how your students are progressing and how they're understanding the content. Today I'm going to talk about these student surveys. In particular, I'm going to talk about what I'm calling pre-lecture surveys. So these are things that I ask students to do outside of class time that give me information about where their head's at, how much they're learning the material, and what they are getting out of it. So the goal of this is to create a formalized way in your course to get this information from your students consistently. So there are pros and cons to this type of thing. One of the best things that you get out of doing pre-lecture assignments is that you get information from your students in real time. So let's say you teach them something on Monday morning, then on Wednesday you want to move on. You want to do new material and you're going to rely on what they learned on Monday. Well, in between those two classes, you can give them a pre-lecture assignment that's going to probe their understanding. It's going to ask them explicitly about the content or how they're feeling about it. Ask them if they have any questions that they want you to go over. And this allows you to adjust what you're going to teach on Wednesday, right? It also requires students to continually participate in class. So it's asking students to engage with the course material outside of class time regularly, right? And we know that that's a benefit for the students. And then finally, this is something you can do online. It does not take any class time. And often when we're asked to do innovations in our classroom, they end up taking us away from the content. And this is something you can do that does not take any extra time. There are always drawbacks. One of them is that it takes time to create these, right? The first time I did pre-lecture assignments in my class, it was a time suck for me. I had to create them. Moreover, I had to make sure that I was consistently communicating with students so they knew how to access these pre-lecture assignments. And then also I had to read their responses. It sounds like a negative, but it's great for me to be able to read what students are thinking about, but it does take time every day before lecture. Another thing people might be concerned about is student perception. How do students view these types of assignments? If I'm asking them to do something in my class that's above and beyond what they might be asked to do in my colleague's class, are they going to give me a bad student evaluation, right? And that matters. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So how do I use these pre-lecture activities in my class? I assign them before every single class meeting. So if I teach twice a week, there are 2 pre-lecture assignments every week. If I teach 3 times a week, there are 3 pre-lecture assignments every week. They're done online. They are 5 to 10 minutes long. They don't take a long time. And they're not graded, but students get credit for them, right? So between 5 to 10% of their overall grade, they get for just completing these pre-lecture assignments. I'm going to give a lot of examples. I actually see in the questions here they would like some examples, and I'm going to give you some in just a moment. They take several different forms, the types of questions I ask on these pre-lectures. Some of them are for research purposes, and I'm not going to talk about those today, but those are, targeted specifically for research. There are also things like reading questionnaires where I ask them to read the textbook, and then I ask them some questions. I might ask them something they learned in a previous class. I might ask them to recall something they learned in a previous course that I'm going to be relying on them to know. Something like complex numbers, for instance, is something that I know they learned in a math class a long time ago. I need them to use it in class on Wednesday. So before Wednesday, I'm going to ask them to think about it. And then also just general feedback and questions. So let's jump into some examples here. I don't have too much time left. Here are some questions that I ask at the beginning of the semester. So is there anything in particular you're hoping to learn from this class? I find this a really valuable question to ask at the beginning of the semester. This course is going to use some mathematical techniques. How familiar are you with those? And I give them a whole bunch of multiple choice options. My possibly favorite question to ask students is, tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with school. I feel like this creates a connection between me and the students. I get to learn more about them, and it really helps create a nice community feeling in the classroom. Reading questions. So these reading questions are ones that I got from a physics teacher article. I highly recommend you take a look at it. What you'll notice about these reading questions are that they are not specific to the content. I don't create a new reading quiz every time I ask them to read a portion of the textbook. Instead, I ask them questions like, what did you learn from this reading? What are you confused about in the reading? And what did this reading make you wonder about? And what questions did it bring to mind? And this really does give me a really good snapshot of how students are understanding what they're reading. It gives me an idea of what I can move on and what I need to really focus on in lecture, because they had a lot of questions about it. What did it make you wonder about? I didn't think I would like this question, but the responses that I got from students were really impressive. They were trying to make connections between the material they were learning in this course and other courses, something they'd seen in the media or in their real lives, and it allowed me to help them make those connections in class. So here's an example of a question of content from a previous class. This is something that would probably be easy for you to write. So this example, last class we found an equation for some physics thing, right? Are there any caveats or situations where this solution won't apply? And then I gave them a list to choose from. General feedback questions are always great to ask several times throughout the semester. So sometimes I use pre-lectures to ask them things like, how's the tempo of the course going for you? Right? What about the homework? Is the homework too hard, too easy? It seems about right. And these questions, I will say that I often share the results with the students, right? And that's something I'm going to talk about actually in a second. Is there anything you want us to go over in the review class on Tuesday? Or, you know, we just finished chapter 5. Is there anything you're still unsure about in chapter 5 that you want me to know about? And give students a way to provide me with that sort of unfiltered feedback. So the lessons that I've learned from doing this for a couple of years now is that these assessments are incredibly valuable. So as a researcher, they're obviously valuable to me, but as an instructor, I was struck by how much I used these to modify what I was doing in class. And I found that I was able to become a better instructor because I was more in tune with what my students were learning. I also found that it was beneficial for the students. The students learned a lot. They enjoyed being engaged with the course at this kind of level constantly throughout the semester. I will say that these materials do need to be integrated into the course in a really thoughtful way. So a couple of things I want to mention is that they need to be made a routine part of the course so that students aren't caught off guard by them. For the first 2 weeks, they kind of lament the fact that they have this they have to do this extra thing, but it quickly becomes just a fabric of the course and they're okay with it. You should offer them for credit. You should offer them for credit because if you value them, you have to give students points for it, right? Or they're not going to value it. You have to read student responses and then you have to respond to them so that students know that you're listening. If students feel like they're doing all this extra work and that's just going out into the void and no one's reading it, then they're going to get resentful. And so you have to find a way to make sure that the students know that you're reading it and you're making changes to the course based on their responses. And then I am going to just give some examples. Sorry, I have some student feedback that I've gotten on student evaluations. The pre-lectures help to make the material taught in class that day much easier. The pre-lectures are helpful. It helps when I read material before the lecture, and the pre-lectures encourage that. I got a lot out of the pre-lectures with actual problems to complete and submit, but less from reading the textbook. More Importantly, I've never received a student comment on an end of semester evaluation that explicitly said they did not like the pre-lectures. If you make it an integral part of the course, I find that students are receptive to it and they appreciate the care that you put in to thinking about your course. So I'm running out of time here. I'm a little over time, so I'm going to finish up. I'm going to say that these types of assessments are really valuable, and by incorporating them thoughtfully into your course, you can make a real difference in how you approach instruction and how students see instruction. And so I would welcome all of you to reach out with me if you have any questions or if you want to chat about this type of assessment informally. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to the next presenter. We have Vimal Viswanathan from San Jose State University talking about assessing student learning in a blended model and flipped classes.
Thank you, Gina. So as Gina mentioned in my talk, I'm going to focus on the assessments that my colleagues and I performed in an NSF-sponsored project on flipped and blended model classrooms. So let me start with an overview of my work on the brain-based instruction pedagogy. This is a framework developed at Tuskegee University when I was working there as an assistant professor with financial support from NSF IU's program, and I continued that work here at SJSU. The idea is to incorporate the existing knowledge on the functioning of human brain and how it learns new concepts into the course design and instructional techniques. We called it a formal name, tailored instructions and engineered delivery using protocols, short form tied up. The idea is, so this idea of brain-based instruction is not necessarily new, but the application of this technique was very rare in higher education when we started working on this project. The project that my colleagues and I envisioned was a media-rich instructional technique that uses 9 protocols that are already existing in the brain-based learning literature. The key point in the brain-based model is to understand how human brain stores concepts and try to make that process a little bit easier for the students. So on this screen, on the left-hand side figure, you can see how the teaching of one of these concepts proceeds. There's a lot of preparation work going on into this. So before the class, the instructor divides the course content into concepts and then prepares a video based on 9 protocols that are identified. So some of those protocols are shown on the right-hand side image here. Due to the time constraint, I'm not going into the details of these protocols because I'm planning to focus more on the assessment part of this project. So essentially, formative assessment is performed on each concept to see how well students grasp that particular concept. And if students do make mistakes, then they have another chance to resubmit that homework or that classwork for part of the grade that they lost in their first attempt. And typically the grading of this homework is pretty fast, so we try to give it back in the next class or so, trying to incorporate a little bit of rapid feedback approach or the mastery approach. And finally, the summative assessment is done at the end of the semester or in the form of a midterm during the semester and things like that. So on the right-hand side picture, you can see that before the course begins, there was a lot of preparation going into that course, the design of that course. So we have each concept that is being divided into multiple sub-concepts, and each sub-concept is analyzed carefully to identify their prerequisites and what information needs to be delivered to the students and things like that. So each concept delivery starts with revisiting the required prerequisites for that concept, and then the information is presented in a predetermined format. That is the primary reason we use videos, because we can follow a script and make sure that students are getting that information in that predetermined format. So here is a quick overview of what is happening in this model. So this is a flow chart of what's going to happen in a typical class. So there is a whole lot of preparation going on from the faculty side, like identifying individual concepts and sub-concepts, identifying the prerequisites, following through the 9 principles or the 9 brain-based learning protocols, and then preparing the video that is outlining all these delivery materials in a specific format. And finally, we upload this into a learning management system where students can see it. So these many components are happening at the instructor side, and the students in their individual space, they get to watch the videos and complete probably a prerequisite quiz or maybe a pre-class quiz. And then in the group space, which is the classroom, they get to watch the video again and discuss with the instructor about the contents of the video, followed by an active learning component, which is known as, so we call it activity sheets. So it is both an active learning component and an assessment. So we perform formative assessment in pretty much every class. And this is followed by a typical homework or some kind of reading assignment at the end of the class. At this point, I typically get the question, what is the difference between this blended classroom or the brain-based learning and the flipped methodology? In fact, there are so many overlaps between these two approaches, and there are so many common elements. But I would call tied up as somewhere in the middle between a traditional classroom and a flipped classroom, mainly because the blended classroom follows a script. And there is a strict policy on where the information comes in and when the information is being delivered to the student. That is the main reason we use videos. So the target is not only the content delivery, where students can watch some kind of a material before they come to class, but also presenting that information in a predetermined order. And with that introduction, let me go to the assessment of this project. So since the topic of discussion today is the assessment, I am going to talk about both the summative and formative assessments we made. So there is a multitude of assessment techniques that we followed across different semesters. So I'm trying to summarize all this information in the next couple of slides or so. So the summative assessment happens mostly during exams and pre and post class test, mainly focused on the concept inventories. So this at SJSU, this was done in a mechanical design class. So we used a statics concept inventory, dynamic concepts inventory, and force concept inventory for pre and post tests. And also, since we expected this approach to improve their critical thinking ability, we used a paid measure, which is a critical thinking ability test, CAT. At least some of you may be familiar with that instrument. And also the exams were graded at a concept level. I'll show you an example in the next slide of how these exams are graded. Let me talk about the formative assessment first. So the formative assessment mostly happened with the activity sheets. So here is a nice example of activity sheet on the right-hand side on the slide. So these activity sheets are given at in every class for every concept. So the activity sheet first asks the students how many times they watched the video, and then they completed an activity that they typically complete in a classroom, but in a more systematic approach. So each question was divided into multiple sub-questions, and students worked in teams, and they had to go through these questionnaires, completing each activity step by step. In addition, we had iClicker quizzes and in-class polls using iClickers. I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with those, so I'm not getting into the details of those. But one thing we did in extra is the concept maps. So this is where students were asked to metacognitively record the information they learned in the new class and connect it to the information from the previous class. So this was an activity where they could place the information in the context of all the things they learned beforehand. And on the bottom of the slide, you can see the grades distribution that was used for exams. So a student will get full grade for a question only if that person identified the concept and connected concepts and solved the question. Just because they solve the question, they won't get the full grade. So let me show you some sample results. So I'm not going to go over all these in the interest of time. So for example, the first graph on the top left-hand corner shows the pre-concept quiz that was given at the beginning of the class. And you can see that 50% of the students kind of failed that exam, which showed me that, okay, I need to start from a very basic level. Maybe I need to go back to my statics or dynamics before I start teaching them about machine design. But this is not possible because of the time constraint. So in the video, I kind of incorporated those concepts. So I started from the statics level and build on top of it to reach to the final concept. So just to summarize this, the lessons learned include always focus on your students, and as long as you can keep them engaged using hands-on activities and group activities, it is going to be fun for them, and they will come about. Although I had some initial resistance, students really enjoyed their class, and I got very positive feedback. And it is always best to evaluate the pedagogies using a combination of formative and summative assessment techniques and a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. So that's my takeaway from all these activities. And I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. Essentially, we are planning to do this on an assembly line of courses as a future work. Just to summarize, in case you are interested in watching these videos, you can go, so there is a link on the screen. You can go ahead and visit that and see how these videos look like. And these videos were really good for engaging the students, and these were watched many times by all the students in my class, and these are used by my colleagues as well. So please feel free to take a look. And this is my last slide. So I would like to acknowledge the funding from NSF, and this is a list of publications that resulted from this project. With that, I would like to give the platform to Dr. Dermot Donnelly from Fresno State. He's going to talk about using knowledge integration rubrics to score assessment items for an undergraduate laboratory. Thank you.
Thank you, Vimal. Hello, everyone. My name is Dermot Donnelly, Hermosillo. I'm a faculty member in the chemistry department at Fresno State with a specialty in chemical education. Something I've been using for several years in my research are knowledge integration rubrics. And they've actually been developed from over 25 years now, actually, and they've been applied across a range of science disciplines. So life sciences, physical sciences, earth sciences. Some more recent work, I believe, is trying to apply them in other areas of STEM as well. And the project I'm going to speak to today is an NSF-funded project. We've started this project since 2017, and it'll finish next year. And I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators on that project, Dr. Fred Nelson, who's an associate professor in the Kremen School of Education, and Dr. David Andrews, who's an emeritus professor in the Department of Biology. So a little bit more about the actual KI framework. It's a constructivist-based framework. So it's really looking to start with what students are bringing to the classroom and trying to build on that knowledge in terms of adding ideas, then helping students distinguish between their old ideas and the new ideas you're trying to introduce, and then also maintaining aspects of reflection so that they can develop more coherent understanding of scientific concepts. So we actually applied the KI rubrics within a laboratory design. This course was set up in such a way that it was meant to teach physical science, both physics and chemistry, to future elementary school teachers. So the way the course had been set up, it was split down the middle, half physics, half chemistry. So there's both pros and cons of an approach like that. A pro is that you'd obviously have strong disciplinary explanations and that you have a specific person explaining their disciplinary content. But then the challenges with an approach like that then is that students can struggle with integrated perspectives because a concept might be explained one way by a physics faculty member, and then it might be explained another way by a chemistry faculty member. But then there's no necessary connections made for students, it's kind of expected that they would make those connections, and that's not always the case. So this is something that's important to consider in terms of maybe possibly moving to an integrated approach. So that's what we did attempt to do with this redesign. We look to have a faculty member teach both physics and chemistry concepts, and as much as possible integrate them in a way that was coherent for students. So that maybe a concept would be viewed from both a microscopic and a macroscopic perspective at the same time, rather than having those seen as kind of maybe potentially two separate entities by students. And this is particularly important for the elementary setting, where young kids typically will ask questions about science from a phenomena-based perspective. And this aligns very much with the next generation science standards at the K-12 level, where it's expected that teachers will manage to support students to plan and conduct their own investigations. So this relates to science and engineering practices. So we want to actually reflect that within our laboratory settings, because the previous laboratory settings were actually more kind of conventional laboratory approaches where the instructions were provided to students. So really they did not get to plan their investigations. They got to conduct investigations, but it wasn't their investigations they were conducting. So we wanted to support that process in terms of both student activity, but then also in terms of assessment. We wanted to see how their conceptual understanding was changing as part of this course. So in terms of the knowledge integration rubric, we actually used the KI framework to develop 9 open response items. And we developed the items across 3 chemistry items, 3 physics items, and 3 integrated items. And again, that was quite an iterative process to work towards that. We had several meetings with both chemistry faculty, physics faculty, and education faculty to really try to tie down, well, what is considered a chemistry item? What is a physics item? What is an integrated item? Oftentimes we were thinking we had maybe a physics item when we were realizing, wait, you could actually use chemistry to try to explain that concept, or vice versa. So there was kind of lots of ideas in terms of looking at that. So I provided an example of an item here. This isn't actually one of our items. This is just a standard item related to knowledge integration that I want to kind of explain the layout of the item so you're understanding what type of insights we might get from a question like this. So this question focuses on different materials in terms of spoons and in terms of what will happen to them if you leave them in hot water. What will feel hotter and why, what are some of the explanations going on there. So based on KI, it's a constructivist framework, and some people can be surprised by this, where students who say they don't know get a score of 1. People might say, why wouldn't they be given a 0 straight away? Well, the reason for the 1 is because, at least as an instructor, we know where we need to go from there. We know that our students don't know, so we don't make an assumption that they don't know. We can show it by an assessment item. Number 2 then would be a non-normative idea, where they might try to suggest something that's incorrect, like plastic is a better conductor, where that's just not accurate. So as an instructor, if you're seeing students mostly getting 2s, that means you have quite a bit of work to do in order to tackle misconceptions that students may have. Based on that then, in terms of you could get up to a partial idea, where they might say something like metal is a conductor, which is not an incorrect idea to say, but it's not really addressing the question. So they have a partial idea there, and that's where they'd get a 3 for a score like that. A normative idea would then be a 4, where they'd explain, where they'd have some element of a comparison, but the response wouldn't be particularly sophisticated. So 5 would be quite sophisticated, where you would have 2 non-normative ideas that would be connected. So in this particular example, a student would mention aspects of conductivity, but also maybe get into aspects of thermal equilibrium as well, if they're getting that type of concept and making those connections. So that's powerful that they would make those connections. So again, we had 9 items here. We assessed students in a pre-post manner. Again, the majority of participants taking this course was 90% female. We have about 40 to 50% Hispanic in terms of the distribution of students taking this particular course. So I've kind of more just summarized some of the findings across 4 semesters rather than presenting graphs. We have several of these in the papers if you want to look at this in more detail. But generally, the outcomes we were getting from these types of assessments were that students would enter the course with mostly non-normative ideas and would leave with partial ideas. They tend to do better consistently on physics items and integrated items as opposed to chemistry items. And some assessments across some semesters would show a laboratory instructor effect. So there's an important role there in terms of how an instructor is going to contribute to your outcomes in these assessments. Students overall, just speaking to the course a little bit more, They'd initially struggle with designing their own experiments, but they actually eventually came to enjoy it. The majority of students would actually enjoy it. There's an initial hesitancy, but generally speaking, they are capable of doing this. And this is even students with may have limited science backgrounds coming into the course. So that's encouraging in our findings. So kind of other lessons learned, some that I may have mentioned already, but constructability is very important in trying to realize, are you actually assessing what you're assessing? And we had revisits there, so it's not trivial to try to be developing your own assessment. Inter-rater agreement for open response items, that takes time. That's why we may be a little bit more delayed in terms of publishing some of our work, but we believe there's merit in it, in ensuring the quality of our scoring and making sure we're not making conclusions from the data that are not the case. It's interesting in terms of the conflicting views for chemistry and physics laboratory instructors, so there are potentials for disciplinary bias there, which are good to address and to bring those out and try to tackle them. Then important then, there's a need for instructor professional development and how we support them, and that's across a range of different things, both in terms of the assessment types, but then also in terms of how they might be supporting students to take ownership. That's much easier said than done because, again, instructors oftentimes have had experiences of conventional settings. So some of the next steps in terms of what we want to look at, it's been tough to mitigate exactly whether it's the instructor causing some of our effects or if it's the actual curriculum. So some future studies we'd like to do are compare both types of conventional lab and guided inquiry based on an instructor teaching both courses at the same time. So if we did see effects, it would most likely be the curriculum, we could argue. We want to embed more technology tools. Now that we've got the kind of underlaid curriculum, we want to actually add technology where we can to support this process. We want to advocate as well for further PD opportunities for students. And if there's opportunities for collaborations with other campuses, that would be great. And then just in summary, I think there's great importance in eliciting student ideas in laboratory settings. There's no point teaching certain things if we're not cognizant of students' prior knowledge. There's value of research experience for students, no matter their science background. I think that's critical. And then lastly, there's value of open response assessments for deep insights in student thinking. That's something like maybe multiple choice wouldn't provide. Here's a list of references that I've related to. I'd like to now introduce our next speakers, who are Seema Shah-Fairbank and Laila Jallo from Cal Poly Pomona, and they're going to be speaking on integrated assessment strategies from course to program to institution. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Seema, and my colleague Laila and I are going to talk about some of the work we've been doing in the College of Engineering, both within our departments and efforts we're making to help with programmatic assessment and institutional assessment, which I think you may find useful in your programs. So the first thing both of us were talking about when we started our project was we really wanted to change the conversation inside of the College of Engineering when we were talking about, are students really just learning content, or are we really solidifying student learning outcomes? And faculty needed to go beyond just making sure they know how to add 1 + 1, but what does addition really mean? We wanted faculty and instructors to also have the opportunity to improve their teaching. And when you do assessment, you really can have that impact of improving your teaching. And always looking at ways to constantly improve. If we're going to be instructors for many years and faculty members, we want to also keep ourselves retooled. And so in today's, as we're doing this, we're going to show you some faculty-driven processes that both Laila and I have implemented, and then implemented something at the college level that's helping not only at program and course level, but also institutional assessment.
So after teaching 2 introductory chemical engineering courses for 2 years, I realized that students were struggling with the fundamental concepts in these courses. So I went looking for ways to help the students remember the concepts. And I found out about concept test questions. They're just multiple choice questions that focus on one key concept at a time. So I designed these questions in my PowerPoint presentation because that's what I use in lecture. And in the classroom on the first day, I made the students sit in groups of 4. And whenever a concept test comes up, they would work on the question together. And then using a flashcard, they would show what the answer is, which of the answers they pick in this case. If I see that everybody in the class got the right answer, then we move on to the next concept. If I see that some of them or as many of them as possible didn't get it, I'll go over the concept again. So this is the result for one of the chemical engineering courses. There are 2 exams on this slide and then the grade distribution for the course. As you can see, the first exam here, this on the left-hand side is the pre-test, that's before introducing concept test, that's the previous year, and the right-hand side is the after introduction of concept test. You look at the averages, you could see this were the averages for the first the exam pre-introduction of concept test, and these were the averages afterwards. There's a slight improvement in the averages of students. But what is also crucial is when you look at the p-values of the student performance in these classes, you can see that there's a significant difference in student performance before introduction of concept test, but there's no significant performance difference here, indicating that I, as an instructor, am able to teach better. I'm teaching consistently. You look at the final, this is the final exam. There's a slight increase in the averages. The p-values don't show very much significant difference, but this is a multiple choice exam in the finals. These are the grade distribution. Pre is the one in green and the red is the post after introducing concept test. You can see some slight improvements in the students' overall grades. The A has increased, B have increased in percentages. There's a decrease in C and a slight decrease in D also. And in the second chemical engineering course is something similar. You look at the averages. This is 2 exams, which is a middle exam, like a midterm exam, and then the final exam down here. You can see the averages again pre-introduction of concept test and averages post-introduction of concept test. There's an increase in student performance. And when you look at the p-values again, you see the same thing. There's a significant difference in student performance in these 2 sections compared to when concept test was introduced, basically reflecting on the way I am teaching the course. I'm being more consistent. The same thing, when you look at the averages for the final exam also, there's an increase in averages for students, and then the p-values are indicating the same thing. There's a significant difference here in student performance. There's no significant difference here. And when you come to the grade distribution for this course, pre and post introduction of concept test, you look at a significant increase in the percentage of students that receive B, and there's a significant decrease in the students that obtain a D. So lessons learned here is that the introduction of concept test improved consistency in student performance. As you can see, there's an increase in averages, and also instructor consistency when you look at the p-values. There was an engagement. Students were able to talk to each other and work together in the classroom, which is regular lecture where faculty just go through PowerPoint. There's improved overall student performance on each of the exams that I showed you on the previous slides. And also there's an indirect student assessment of learning gain survey that is not shown here, where the students were satisfied with including concept tests. So the close the loop strategies that was implemented after this was increasing complexity of the concept tests that were embedded in the PowerPoint, and also concept tests were introduced in most other courses in chemical engineering.
So this was a really important example of doing something in a course to help with student learning and improve student experiences. So this next is more about an assignment. And the goal of the assignment was really to work with students on their written communication skills. Many students in the civil engineering program we were noticing were struggling. We also wanted to see if we could develop an assignment where you could assess multiple learning outcomes at the same time. So as an engineering program, we are required every 6 years to go through accreditation. We have a set of standards that we need to show our students are learning to. And so the assignment I'm going to share with you actually addresses three of the 7 different learning outcomes. So we could assess multiple learning outcomes at the same time. We can also grade this assignment, but I'm going to be focusing on assessment and not grading in this particular explanation. But this assignment assessed written communication, ability to recognize ethical and professional responsibilities, and an ability to acquire new knowledge and apply it. The students were asked in the spring of 2019 to write a critical evaluation on the Oroville Dam failure that happened in Northern California. They had to support their position with peer-reviewed and other relevant sources, which is really an important task, like understanding how to do information literacy. They were evaluated on multiple areas on their ability to identify the problem and issue, providing perspective and position, evidence, conclusion, and their citations. Within the classroom, to be honest, in 2019, I did very little. I gave them a little background on the Oroville Dam, and I provided them with some written communication modules. I wasn't sure how much information they knew in terms of information literacy. I developed a rubric. It was a 4-point rubric. I did this in consultation with a lot of other stuff that I was working on at the time. And the rubric is aligned to all three of the learning outcomes I had mentioned earlier. So when you're going in and you're looking at SO3 and 4, SO3 was written communication, SO4 was ethical and professional responsibilities, and SO7 was new knowledge. So we're able to actually see how students are doing. If you're looking at the results, when you look at these results on the first go-around, majority of students are performing in the introductory and developing range, the red and yellow. And this was really concerning. I was expecting more students to be proficient in mastery, and so I really needed to kind of take a deeper diving look into it. So at the time, I was like, okay, I need to close the loop on this class. There's something going on. The institution at the same time was doing an institutional assessment on information and written communication. And what they were noticing is students' performance in many in the information literacy skills and also in the development of idea skill on a written communication rubric was actually, many students were 30 to 45% of the students were below where we would like them to be. They were performing at developing an introductory level. At the time, the Office of Assessment and Program Review, which I actually at the time was the faculty director for the office, I was the inaugural assessment director for the campus, we started doing a lot of workshops, written communication. We offered rubric redesigning workshop, transparent assignment, information literacy, how to embed it into our classrooms. And what we were able to do was we redesigned the assignment. We collaborated with civil engineers and librarians. We developed a scaffolded assignment where you have an annotated bibliography, a draft essay, a peer review, and then a final essay. I targeted instruction. The engineering librarian came to our course twice, once to provide information on how to find and evaluate sources, how to cite sources, and one to help them, once they had peer reviewed their papers, how to integrate their sources better. We also provided instruction on what engineering ethics and the different situations in the problems are. And we created a transparent design, which include a clear purpose, learning objective, task, evaluation, and information like that. And if you would like to see that, since it's too hard to put on a PowerPoint, feel free to email me and I will send that to you. The results were incredible. What we noticed was on every criteria, student improvement was significantly improved, particularly in problem identification, organization, development, perspective, and conclusion. We saw the most improvement in citation and evidence, which really spoke well to the librarian instruction. So we're continuing to work on how to intentionally improve written communication skill and the ethical and professional responsibility skills so that we can have a greater improvement in student learning. But we are slowly moving into more students hitting developing and proficiency.
So in 2018, the College of Engineering received an exemption for critical thinking, which is a GEA3 course. And the faculty in the college assessment committee decided to design an assignment that would assess critical thinking across the college. We debated and we agreed on using our senior capstone or senior project assignment. Usually this is group-based, but we decided we still want to use it. So based on the inspired work that Seema did, we decided to use that format to design the assignment. With this assignment, we're able to assess ABET outcomes as well as institutional learning outcomes. So what we're actually assessing is ABET criteria, which is 6, critical thinking, communication skills, which is 3, and information literacy. The communication skills and information literacy data will be submitted to the university. Critical thinking also will be submitted to the university, but we use it also for ABET assessment. So basically, this is the prompt for the assignment, where we have individual students. Instead of having group, we would have individual students write summary of their project work. So they write a report. So we gave them instructions. They're going to follow certain instructions to write example. They would write about the problem they're solving, the perspective, basically literature search component, the objective, the results, conclusion, and references. So we gave them a format as to what they're supposed to do. And so we collected 100 student assignments so far. We're going to norm and score the assignments over the summer and present the results to College of Engineering during our fall conference. And then the assessment committee will work on closing the loop and continue to evaluate additional outcomes.
So in summary, what we really saw was concept tests really helped with course-based instruction and improving student learning and engagement in the classroom. Also consistency. Redesigning assignments, integrating the librarian really helped with improving student performance, and actually was able to create assignments that not only address program course level assessment, program level assessment, but institutional assessment. By incorporating instruction from outside, not just you as the instructor, really helped and also took away some of the burden in areas you may not be an expert in. And that's really where the librarians came in and really helps with. And we also saw a real huge improvement in student engagement when they were also asked to do stuff. So all the information we've presented, not only can it be provided at course improvement as an instructor, but also at program and at institutional assessment when institutions are looking for artifacts. Thank you for your time, and I would love to introduce Anya Goodman from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and she's going to speak on can assessment help transform students from point collectors into scientists?
Thank you. So I'd like to share with you my journey in trying to redesign an upper-level biochemistry course to a course that would help students develop into STEM researchers. And I use STEM researchers in a really broad sense as sort of people who possess not just disciplinary skills, but also research skills and science identity. And traditionally, that happens during mentored undergraduate research when students sort of work one-on-one with their advisors. And there's lots of documented evidence that that is unbelievable for retention, for sort of students progressing in STEM careers. However, that experience doesn't scale, and often students, especially students from groups that are underrepresented in STEM, they don't know to seek that. And so as an alternative to this mentored research, one option is to introduce students to research in a course-based setting where that's sort of expected experience for all. So I've been collaborating with a group of faculty around the country, developing curriculum, disseminating it, and developing assessments for biochemistry labs. And at Cal Poly, the course I was trying to redesign is an upper-level lab that meets 7 hours per week. Typically, we have 2 sections, 16 students each. Some quarters I teach it by myself, some quarters with a colleague. And really important when you are trying to implement a cure, I think one of the most important things is making sure that the course goals, like learning goals for students, align well with research goals. So in my case, understand how to purify proteins and study them was the learning goal. and the research goal just fit right in, where we just focus on unknown proteins. So the redesign seemed really easy. Before we have two parts, we purify one protein, analyze it, purify second protein, analyze it, right? So how hard can it be to do a cure? I kept the first part, shortened it a little bit, and now in the second part is this great research activity where instead of GFP protein that everyone studies, we have new proteins that no one really understands. So this first version of cure implementation, I added a new learning goal, and I swapped one of the activities. You can probably guess how well that went when you do something like that. And the problem I was seeing is that here I am trying to nurture these great traits that I think my future researchers are going to have, the inquisitive, self-motivated, deep thinkers, resilient to failures. And the questions I was getting from students were from standard, will this be on the test and how many points is this worth, to how many points will I lose if I don't get the right answer on a research project? So thinking back to kind of how the system is set up, I have a reward system in the class where there's limited number of points, a list of things for students to do, and every time they make a mistake, they lose points, right? So how does that reward system encourage what I'm trying to sort of nurture? And so the problem was really disconnect between the goals and my reward system, and also between the assessments, specific assessments I was using. Trevor Anderson, the author of this paper I'm citing here, is on our Basel team in the education research part. One of his earlier papers really had this diagram that I like, that we really have a lot of interdependence and things need to be in alignment. Course learning objectives line up to what we teach, what we assess, and both of those determine what students learn. And in my quick redesign, that version 1, what I assess and how I assess was not aligned with what I was trying to accomplish. And so how students learn really depends on how you assess. So version 2.0, I reframed how we do even the first activity, right? We start talking about research and developing these skills from day one. So my first part is still in place, but now it's a boot camp. It's preparing students for research. And then the assessment really had to change drastically. I've added poster presentation. I've changed the reward system to giving a checklist. Here's what you need to do for a C. And if you want a higher grade, you got to go above these expectations. And I've started using the 3D lab system, and I'll mention it briefly here. It's a framework for evaluating assessments that grew out of framework for K-12 science education, and the publication is from 2016, that really describes sort of that you don't have to just limit yourself to disciplinary core ideas. A rich assessment would also include the dimension of scientific and engineering practices, as well as these global cross-cutting concepts. And if you go into the paper, they describe really well how you can do this not just with open-ended, but also selected response questions. And I put one example of how I was doing assessment. So I give students 3 pieces of data from the experiments they're doing, and I ask them, can you select a likely explanation? And so this question can be framed as an open-ended question as well. And so you can see this requires both disciplinary concept and scientific practices. And what I realized is this is a really hard question. And in order for students to succeed, I really have to change how I teach. And we need scaffolding and we need formative assessments along the way. So what I started doing is model the reasoning based on the real data that we were getting. The nice thing is once you make mistakes the first time around, then you have all this data you can use to create these assessments. So I would give students the graph here on the left. Here is the data, right? Walk them through. What do you see? What does it mean? Come up with hypothesis. Test the experiment. And in class, students really engaged and argued about it. And that's before they even do an experiment. And then we continue practicing that reasoning in a guided practice situation through homework and classroom activities. So here's some more data from previous lab notebooks. The nice thing about using old notebooks, students see what's lacking and how important it is to include controls and good notes. And the amount of scaffolding and guiding that goes in, here's just one example. We're talking about a picture, but this picture informs us about multiple steps in the procedure students did, and they have to commit to some decision. Was the desired outcome achieved or not? What specifically in this picture supports that conclusion? So just to kind of move into summative assessments, we've done poster sessions. Students really seems like they got into making crafty things with tape and glue. And it follows the recommendation for cuers to use more authentic scientific communications. And for my summative assessment for the course, I've switched to doing lab practical being part of it. And so this last winter, last day of class, I brought an egg, I cracked an egg, I gave it to students and said, here, can you determine hydrolase activity? And the prompt for that was already given to them from the beginning. So from the start, this is what we're practicing on: performing procedures, keeping good records, drawing conclusions, evaluating results, and on the lab final, they're able to demonstrate that in the 3 hours, even if it's on a teeny slice of this. Oops, sorry, something moved too fast. So in summary, for cure implementation and development assessments, it's really important that we align assessments really well with outcomes and activities. We create these scaffolded learning paths with formative assessment checkpoints and use authentic assessments. So just a brief, something happened, sorry. For the basal group, we are sharing our curriculum. This summer, we're working on creating a fully online version of the curriculum. And then with assessments, our research, education researchers defined anticipated learning outcomes, and we're now working on how to turn them into verified learning outcomes. So I have a couple of reference slides, but I want to thank my collaborators, and I forgot to mention NSF funding for the IUs for this project.
Thank you, Anya, and everyone for your great work on assessment. It's really outstanding, and I'm confident it was well received by the audience. We do have a little bit of time for Q&A. I have one here. This is to Vimal. How did you manage the time to do formative assessments in your blended classroom, especially considering our classes are already packed with course materials?
That's a great question. So if you want to do formative assessment in addition to what is already existing in your course, that's going to be very difficult and time consuming. So what I did is like in every class, I asked students to solve problems. I show them example and ask them to work on a similar example problem. So I kind of converted the same problem into a formative assessment platform. So instead of creating new activities specifically for formative assessment, I was mostly doing the same existing activities, but I changed the format and pre-designed it in such a way that I can collect some data on student learning from those. The only extra thing that came up in my design was the concept maps, which I asked students mostly to do as a homework rather than in class. So that's how I could manage time to do formative assessment in pretty much every class. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks, Vimal. Our next question, I think, would be perhaps one for Regis here. How do you implement equitable assessments on student performance when socioeconomic disadvantages are exacerbated by remote learning?
Yeah, this is a big question, and I certainly can't hope to address everything it encompasses, and hopefully my colleagues can weigh in as well. But I think just being aware that there is not going to be one solution is part of the solution. You know, you may have to try different things, but you are probably the one that knows your students and your classroom context the best. So working within that framework to think about what they need. And just from the beginning, designing your class in a way that levels the playing field. So maybe not using as many high stakes assessment, not limiting their grade to like 1 or 2 tests that take up a large amount of the points. Particularly being cognizant that, you know, requiring your students to be online at a certain time of day to take a proctored exam, particularly if that's like a high traffic time of day or they share their computer with someone else in the classroom, it just might not be reasonable. And by doing something different, right, opening it for a longer window, making more frequent, shorter stakes assessments, that can benefit everyone, not just the students that particularly need it. Also, if you are going to do anything like having them upload files at the end of the assessment, practice with that beforehand, right? Everyone is stressed in a test environment, so give them plenty of opportunities to get used to the system before it's high stakes. I know that SDSU specifically has put out some resources to address this. You may want to check with your individual university, Center for Teaching and Learning, Instructional Technology, and also just make plans to check in with your students and acknowledge them as humans, right? They might be scared to tell you that they've got something going on, but if you ask every student to check in with you at virtual office hours for 5 minutes, you can just say, hey, this is how the class is planned. Are you aware of anything that might present an issue? And just try to let the students know that you see them, you care about them, and you're willing to work with them. I think that's a big step toward being equitable.
Great, thank you. Seema, do you have a quick addition to this?
Yeah, I wanted to just share when we were doing the background research on transparent assignment design. This comes out of UNLV. They had done a really nice presentation on equity, and what they noticed was when we as instructors are more transparent with our instruction to exactly what our students need to be doing. I think Anya also shared that in the way she was presenting, a really transparent approach, knowing what they are expected to do. They show a significant increase in students from disadvantaged communities performing to a much higher standard.
Well, thank everyone, because we are a little short in time today. Speaker contact information is provided on the next slide. For more information on any of the presentations, I encourage the attendees to please contact the speakers, as this could lead to a collaboration or proposal opportunity. In addition, a link to the webcast will soon be made available on the STEMnet website. Before we wrap up, a few announcements. Answers to questions submitted during the registration period and not answered during the webcast on the open chat will soon be made available on the private CSU STEMnet Facebook. In addition, we'll be emailing a feedback survey to our registrants today. Please take a moment to respond, as your feedback is very important to us. For more information on this webcast, please contact Monica Alacon or myself. Previous webcasts can also be found on the STEMnet website there. And finally, a few words. The late Lloyd Ferguson was a professor at Cal State LA for over 20 years. Born during the Spanish flu epidemic, he excelled in chemistry, doing his BS and later his PhD from UC Berkeley in 1943, where he worked with Nobel laureates Glenn Seaborg and Melvin Calvin. He started his career at North Carolina A&T and then Howard University. He was instrumental in starting ACS Project SEED, which has supported thousands of economically disadvantaged high school students in summer research experiences. Lloyd was the first PI of the NIH MBRS program at Cal State LA, which has inspired and supported thousands of students and faculty throughout the CSU system. I met Lloyd while I was a student at Cal State and recall our discussions. He was a spirited and engaging man, a tall man, who loved bridge. I remember walking by him and a cadre of faculty often playing during lunch in the chemistry building. Lloyd was African American and the first to receive his PhD in chemistry from UC Berkeley. Lloyd wrote a number of organic textbooks during the 1940s and 1950s. The irony is that these books were used in the Deep South and in schools where he was neither allowed to attend nor teach. Lloyd retired from the CSU in 1986 and passed away in 2011 at the age of 93. Black lives do matter. It is people like Lloyd whose life has mattered for so many of us and for so many years. Through his pain has come so much good. In honor of the Lloyds past and present, please take time today to listen, learn, reflect, and develop a plan to address racial equality and to make the world a better and just place for all. To everyone there, to all of our presenters and all the attendees, may you have a wonderful day. Goodbye.